We even had whistles, made from the toe bones of deer, perhaps for coordinating the hunt. "18,000 years ago, our ancestors invented the bow and arrow, as well as producing high-speed spear throwers capable of felling a deer in full flight. Our hands never seemed to rest. With flint blades, we made points, scrapers, and carving tools. And with them, we made Europe's very first works of art, true-to-life etchings of animals. And sculptures, such as these swimming deer, with all life's proper dimensions, and realism down to the folds of skin around their eyes. 23,000 years ago, a human, in Europe, sat down and carved this tiny, exquisite head. Heavily pregnant figures like these have been found right across Europe, from France to the Soviet Union. The end of the Neanderthals and our arrival took place in one of Europe's warm periods. Then, 20,000 years ago, the ice started to move again. Another ice age had begun. The Neanderthals had evolved physically to withstand the cold. But would modern man be able to cope with the same bitter conditions? Unlike their thick-coated companions, they were not biologically adapted to the cold. They had to use their wits. Right up at the very edge of the ice, where there were no trees to build shelters, they built them instead out of the animals they killed. 15,000 years ago, huts made of the bones of mammoths. They were built by people on the move, and they were temporary. When in use, they would have had skins drawn tightly over the frame. Whole encampments were made this way. One site in modern Czechoslovakia had used the remains of 900 mammoths. Astounding testimonies to human inventiveness. The peak of the cold corresponds to a peak of creativity. It was now that people began to paint, and paint the principal object of their desire, their prey, like the bison. But the paintings were no clumsy efforts. In Altamira, in northern Spain, on the ceiling of a cave, there are paintings that are 14,000 years old, which are surely masterpieces. The very contours of the rock have been used to recreate the hunched power of a bison. These ceilings were discovered in 1879 by a 9-year-old girl. Her father, an archaeologist working in the cave, was so engrossed by the debris on the floor, he never thought to look up. The paintings matched their subject so perfectly that at first, other archaeologists refused to believe that they were what they were. They said they must be fakes. Why they were painted, no one can know. Maybe the cold had driven the great herds of bison away. Perhaps painters were trying to persuade the gods to bring them back. In the cave at Altamira, along with the herd of 26 painted bison, the artists left marks on the ceiling where they'd run their fingers along the muddy rock, marks which remain to this day. It's possible to work out the exact technique of the prehistoric artists. First, they used a stone to scratch out the animal's shape, and then over that made a charcoal outline. Then the paint. Rocks were ground up and mixed with water or a little fat and were applied by finger. Black color came from rocks containing manganese, and red and yellow from different kinds of ochre colored by iron oxide. If Altamira's vision of bison is the prehistoric Sistine Chapel of Spain, France has Lascaux, 750 kilometers away. The same masterful execution, with a larger assortment of subjects. Perhaps there was a school of painters, a guild, even a priesthood, who decorated caves throughout the region. But what are they for? Why are they so often in places so hard to reach? Maybe they're illustrations for hunting lessons or for stories. Maybe they were done for pleasure or decoration, or all of these. There's no reason why they couldn't have had their own Rembrandt, or for that matter, poets, musicians, or philosophers. There's no reason why they couldn't have had a rich culture, and by the evidence of their painting, they probably did. It's just that paintings are the only messages to make it from their age to ours. And until somebody invents time travel, we'll simply never know. For the new Europeans, the reward for surviving an ice age was a much improved continent. The world emerged from the melting ice cap, as if from a cocoon, newly shaped, fresh, well-watered, vibrant. It was the beginning of an era of warmth that, with minor fluctuations, was to last until today. It was the beginning of our Europe. Our mountain ranges are the result of larger and more solid mountains being covered by ice, and where they poked above the ice, shattered by frost and becoming the jagged peaks of today. The shape of our landscape is the cumulative result of many ice ages working on a basic landmass, each one taking up where the last left off, cutting deeper valleys, carving steeper mountains, scouring the rocks, leaving marks. When water is frozen and yet flowing, however slowly, the power is massive. It can grasp a mountain and flatten it, pick up its debris and dump it in incongruous piles, hundreds of kilometers away. And then, when the ice goes, there's a brand new topography waiting for life. Up to now, there had been one basic human way of making a living. Restless, often nomadic, hunting and gathering, following their prey. Ever since our ancestors arrived in Europe, their life had been mainly a matter of making the best of unhappy conditions. But where they found themselves now was in a relative land that seemed to be made for them. People could settle permanently beside lakes and never exhaust the food supply. From all over Europe comes evidence of humans settling down in this Garden of Eden. And as always, inventing new ways of exploiting it. One group of people in Denmark developed a highly sophisticated eel fishing technology with canoes, night lighting, and special forked spears for gripping the slippery prey. These people were so well surrounded by resources that they probably didn't have to work for more than 20 hours a week and had a lot of time for art, music, storytelling. Fish was the perpetual resource. So important that in at least one settlement, at Lepenske Veer on the Danube, the people carved fish for gods. These people left behind remains of birds, fish, game, and in some places stacks of shells. The shells in shell middens, found in prehistoric sites all over Europe, still lie where they were thrown after the flesh was plucked out of them. Maybe swallowed raw, or maybe put into a stew, boiled with hot stones. This midden in Portugal, though nearly hidden by the trees on it, is enormous and must have taken hundreds of years to accumulate. It represents a society so settled that generations of people were buried in the great shell pile that they themselves had helped create. All through the new, warm Europe, such displays of permanence herald the end of the hunting and gathering lifestyle. For thousands of years, in competition with many other animals, humans had been eating seeds, selected from as many as 150 different species. But there wasn't much nourishment here for some human. And then, in what is now Iraq, there was an amazing stroke of good fortune. 2 wild grasses had hybridized, and the grains they produced enough food suddenly became much easier. The more so because the fat seeds tended to fall near their parent plants and to create large clusters. And that may have suggested the revolutionary idea of planting. Over 10,000 years ago, long before Europe had either the plants or the knowledge, Near Eastern farmers were planting, tending, and harvesting their crops. The addition of agriculture to the human range of skills has been called our greatest revolution. The collected heads of wheat had to be processed. First, the seeds had to be freed from their spiky glooms. It's thought by singeing. Then, after winnowing to remove the husk, the loose grain could be laboriously ground into flour. Hunter-gathering had needed exceptionally game-rich areas for any sort of permanent base. Most people were continually on the move, following their prey. Farming meant that the whole continent, the flatter parts at least, was open to human settlement. Compared to the varied diet of the roaming hunter-gatherers, the new one seems pretty dull. Flour could be made into gruel, or mixed with a little water and fat, kneaded into unleavened cakes. Given taste, perhaps, by honey. But there was meat, too, because soon after people began controlling the plant life around them, they took the next logical step and domesticated animals. Starting with the dog as a hunting assistant, prehistoric people developed from the idea of growing your own seeds to the concept of raising your own prey. And they tamed a succession of now familiar species. Sheep, goats, pigs, cats, and cattle, and about a dozen others. The precursors of today's docile domestic animals were often formidable beasts. The ancestral type of sheep, for instance, were tough, aggressive, and extremely athletic. Exactly how our ancestors the very finest, known as loess, was picked up by wind and water and deposited again in thick layers. In swathes that followed the prevailing winds across the continent. And loess left by the ice made very good farmland, fertile and easy to work. The first European farmers spread along the bands of loess wherever they led. Of course, the rest of nature hadn't been waiting for agriculture to find its way to Europe. Often, forests had already grown up on the fertile loess. Eight 8,000 years ago, the European paradise suffered its first great wave of deforestation. Then later, cattle came, not for their beef so much as for their living muscle, pulling wooden plows. This broke up the former forest soil and aerated it, and brought new nutrients to the surface for new crops. Agriculture, while bringing stability, brought other changes too. Farmers could build permanent houses, sheltering the same family for generations. This is Lac de Chalain in France, the site of houses 5,500 years old, which archaeologists have been able to reconstruct. From the site, they've excavated clay pots, beakers, cheese molds full of holes. There are even cores of chewed crab apples and singed ears of corn. For all the security that agriculture conferred, it also meant the end of the 20-hour working week. The labor was long, and the ties to the land were firm. For some, it was miserable. These bones tell the story of a grueling, brutish life. She was a young woman, somewhere between 18 and 24. Her toes are arthritic, with large masses of bone growth where none should be, probably caused by repeated and excessive pressure. The knees are arthritic too. In life, these deformed and calloused joints must have caused the woman unbearable pain. The vertebrae from her lower back are crushed and bent. For most of this young woman's life, she could have spent as much as 5 hours a day on her knees at the grindstone. But why did they bother? Once the population began to rise, there wasn't enough game to return to hunter-gathering, so it was agriculture or starvation. As the Bible says, we were indeed cursed to eat bread in the sweat of our faces. Agriculture may have brought a heightened awareness of certain aspects of nature. Astronomy, for example. It seems to have been a factor in the orientation of houses. Some of them seem to have been aligned with the summer solstice. An effect of farming, perhaps, was an increased sensitivity to the seasons. So far had people progressed from temporary huts that they had permanent buildings for the dead, long barrows. And some of them were aligned towards the winter solstice. Summer for the living, winter for the dead. And inside, designs, circles, interpreted by some as expressions of the unbroken, unending cycle of life and death. This tomb, Newgrange in Southern Ireland, was built over 5,000 years ago. It was built, and it was built meticulously. These gigantic European tombs were the most impressive monuments in the world. Even the pyramids wouldn't be started for more than 1,000 years. The huge stone monuments, megaliths, often dominate the surrounding countryside. Focal points for the farming community, perhaps a mark of ownership and permanence. Another monumental fashion spread from either northern France or the Iberian Peninsula. Huge standing stones, such as these in Portugal. Individual stones became circles. From Portugal to Scotland. "5,000 years ago, all over Europe, from the scrublands of Portugal to the bleak islands of Scotland, as far east as Palestine, and at many points in between, people were building stone circles, megaliths, without any apparent direct communication between one community and another. Why? Was it simply a stage in human development that everyone was going through at the same time? Was there communication? And was this a sort of world religion? The bones and tools of our early ancestors are open to analysis and interpretation, but their thoughts and beliefs are not. By now, agriculture had reached a peak of success. The population had grown. Farmland was hard to find. And for the first time in European history, people built fortresses to defend it. The tools they used to build them and the weapons they used for defense were not made of stone. So far, Europe and its various peoples had been molded and driven by ice. Now, they turned to fire. 6,500 years ago, the age of metals had begun. Starting with copper, Europeans began their exploration of the geological resources the continent had to offer. A process upon which all our subsequent history would be built.